Greetings. The following is a production of the Greensboro and Charlotte Scottish Rite Valleys. The opinions expressed here are those of the hosts and the host alone, and in no way reflect the opinions of the Greensboro or Scottish Rite Valleys or the ancient and accepted Scottish Rite as a whole. Hope you enjoy the show.
Welcome back. This time we're doing the 18th degree Knight of Rose Croix. Now I'm going to say Rose Croix because we're from the South. Chuck's going to say Rose Croix.
Well, maybe not.
Just go back and forth.
I mean, I grew up saying Rose Croix, so.
As you guys can see, we're both in a different location. The mystery location here, we'll just be interested as people watch the video to let us know if you recognize this place. If you don't, I suggest you go on a quest and find this lodge room because it's a place that everybody should visit. Also, you'll notice that we have an all-star cast today. All the team is here. Most worshipful brother Brad Shaw is back with us. My buddy Noah from the Charlotte Valley, and this long, tall Texican on my left right here is Chuck Dunning, who is somewhat of an expert in the 18th degree. I've seen him do at least 2 programs on it, both fabulous, and he was going to be in town for something anyway, so we decided that we would pick him up and throw him into the team as a ringer, and we look forward to what you're going to add to the degree. So we expect this to be a pretty long podcast, or podcast style version of this, because there is a lot of ground to cover in the 18th degree. It's one of the terminal degrees. It's loaded with both messaging and symbolism. So we will dive right into all of this. So there's actually 2 sets of symbols that go along with this degree. And so one has the square and compasses with a little crown, and there's a pelican with these 7 babies and plucking their own breasts and feeding the babies, and the collar is red, and it's got that little jewel on it, and then the apron is white and it's fringed in red, and then you kind of swap over to this other set of regalia halfway through this thing, and it's got different colors. It's still got, well, that one's got the eagle, and it's got a cross, and it's still got the crown, the square and compasses in the master's fashion with a little rocker on the bottom. And then it's got like a black apron with a red cross on it, and the cordelier, the collar-looking thing, is black on one side and red on the other. So you can tell right from the beginning with the symbolism that there's like 2 aspects of this degree, which is going to come together and make one degree in the end. Just some of the duties, just to run through them real quick, and this is all out of Rex's book. We do this every time. The duties are to practice virtue, labor to eliminate vice, purify humanity, be tolerant of the faith and creed of others. The lessons are to have faith in God, hope in victory over evil, charity, tolerating the errors and faults of others. The reflection is to do evil and calmly exist to provide an opportunity for the practice of virtue. This is something that we're going to visit later in the program, one of the big ideas. Symbols are the constellations of faith, hope, and charity. They figure very predominantly. The punishments and terrors of hell, the rose and the cross, and the pelican and the eagle, which we've already explained. Rex says on page 135 that this degree sets forth the coming of the new law. It's going to be one of the other things we're going to talk about near the end of the program, but it's kind of where we're going with this degree in a large sense. And in the ritual, it's just a quote that I pulled that I like. It says that this degree unfolds the knowledge required preparatory to receiving the royal secret. So this is everything in the Scottish Rite kind of sets up things down the road, and that's what this is kind of setting us up for. So far, so good, fellas. Anybody want to comment on any of that before we press on into the degrees?
I can't wait to take notes.
Okay. So at this point, we're going to do kind of the basic storyline. And there's not really a storyline in the way that some of the other degrees have a actual story. There's no real plot as such, but what we have is 3 apartments. The first one is kind of represents despair and sorrow. The second one is the abode of the damned. It's kind of a hell scene. And then the third is optimism, joy, and calm certainty. And the last one is very bright. Just one thing of note: chapters never close. We only dispense with and resume labor. So once you learn the lessons of this degree, you don't just pass them on by; they're always with us. All right. So the first apartment, this room is darkened, and so we don't really do this in Greensboro. I don't know what y'all do in Charlotte, but you're supposed to have hangings like curtains and that kind of, or different colors, and they set the tone for the degree. So this room is darkened and it's hung in black, strewn with tears. We've seen this symbolism a lot before. It's suffering and sorrow, right? It's despair. It's down. There are broken columns. And broken working tools kind of laid all around, and they call this the dark chamber, is what Pike calls it. And there's these three triangular columns that are still intact with faith, hope, and charity. And kind of the way it works in the degree is they're triangular, so you can kind of turn them where you can see them or not see them at different times during the degree. Because sometimes we have lost our faith, hope, and charity, and we can't see it, and then sometimes we see it and we're actively working with it, right? So all that's there. So the columns, this is a quote from the ritual. The columns and working tool. Just a note, so I don't get in trouble, since a lot of people are probably going to watch this. When I say a quote from the ritual, there's a few places that I pulled parts of sentences of the ritual out, but most of that comes from either the Magnum Opus ritual, the Formulas in Ritual, old stuff, or in the Purple Book,
The monitoring guide.
Yeah, the monitoring guide. So I'm not just quoting ritual here. It's all in print. The columns and working tools of the old masonry are shattered, and the cubical stone has sweated blood and water. And at that instant, the true word was lost. So that there's a lot in those two sentences. There's a lot of meat there. One is the old masonry, which implies that there's going to be a new masonry after the end of it at some point during this degree, doesn't it? Yes. No one says yes.
Absolutely.
I mean, that was the one thing that struck me. And the whole idea of the cubical stone, sweated blood and water, I think we know where that's taken us. So the candidate comes in, and he's told that everything is lost, right? Doom and gloom, yet we will endeavor to discover the true word. Mm-hmm. So there's all this talk about how we're in despair, and the working tools are broken, and the columns have fell down, but we will continue to work. Mm-hmm. Lesson there for us? Yes, you got
perseverance.
Masonry is work, isn't it, boss?
That's what we say all the time. Mm-hmm. And we're going to learn a new lesson around what that work should be in this degree.
Yeah. Absolutely. So just a taste of some of this doom and gloom talk that the candidate is getting from the officers. They're talking about how men inflict pain and shed blood. Men prey on each other as beasts. Despair and doubt settle like a darkened cloud. Only here and there does civilization break through the darkness of human barbarism. And there's just a few, but there's a whole bunch of that. So you're kind of setting that mood for the candidate that he's in a bad place, right? And we're going to a better place by the end of this degree.
My note on that is very depressing with lots of underlines.
Yeah, so at once this degree is kind of talking about us personally, and it also can be talking about us as a fraternity or as a society. Yes. So then the officers offer this, though, as we come out of that doom and gloom part. We say, where can we find justice? Where can we look for mercy and love? Right? How can the just, loving, and merciful God, who's omnipotent, allow these wrongs? It's kind of an awakening. It's coming out of the despair, and to me, this is showing hope. We're asking these questions because we hope there is a better future ahead. And that's what I took from it. Then we say, my brother, you have declared your readiness to aid us in the search for the true word. So there's a part where they ask him, are you willing to undertake this? Oh, yeah, I can't wait, as the candidates always say. Yeah, I can't wait. And so then the search begins. So we're kind of circumambulating around the lodge. And as we're doing this, these constellations appear of faith, hope, and charity. So he's walking around the lodge with I think it's the master of ceremonies that's actually conducting him around. And they go around a couple times, and they see faith, and they go around, and they see hope, and then they see charity. And then when you're done doing all that, the master of ceremonies brings the candidate back to the wise master, and the wise master asks if he has found what he searched for, and the candidate's answer is no. No. And the wise master asks the master of ceremonies if any stars have appeared to dispel the darkness, and the answer to that is yes. And he said the constellations of faith, hope, and charity. And so then they explain the importance of this to the candidate. And something that we're going to tackle later, I thought it was interesting that the wise master knew that he had seen the way, and the master of ceremonies knew that he had seen the way, but the candidate didn't know. So he had seen the way, he just didn't recognize it. But they knew, because they work in those quarries, right, or in those realms. So anyway, we tell the candidate that charity is faith and hope and action, and by these it will show us how to discover the lost word. Great. So the candidate didn't understand all that, but these other guys did. So the candidate is asked if he had faith and hope in the Masonic sense, and if he would follow the new law, yet to be defined. Just, will you follow the new law? Oh yeah, of course I will. And then we obligate him. So the obligation has several of the usual things. We're going to keep the secrets of the chapter, and we're going to, be a good knight and all that stuff. All very important. But one thing that is in that obligation that to me is very that stood out is this: that I will hold Scottish Rite Masonry to be above all controversies of churches, parties, states, and nations, and will never countenance persecutions, or the reviling of others on account of their political, philosophical, or religious opinions. If you take that obligation and you don't mean it, then that's on you. But if you take that and you mean it, you better watch yourself on social media and in your conversations with your brothers.
You better watch yourself reading social media. Forget
Yeah.
even what you write. Just seeing the opinions of others that you disagree with and not vehemently opposing them like that. You got to watch yourself.
Yeah.
That's a good point.
And it's fine to have different, political or social or philosophical views. I mean, it's fine to have that and to argue about that. But I think the key here, where they're getting around to, is, hey, I've got to respect your opinion. I don't have to agree with you. I can try to convince you that I'm right and you're wrong. But I got to respect your opinion as much as I want you to respect mine, even when I think you're wrong.
Well, and I think that goes back to in the 15th degree when we talk about liberty of thought. In the 15th degree, there's an ancient association in that degree with liberté de pensée, which is liberty of thought in French. And that is a reality of our existence. Every one of us is free to think our own thoughts. We can't change that. Dictators try, but it can't be changed. That is a reality. And so to acknowledge that reality is to extend the same freedom that I know that I have to everyone else, and to recognize and respect that freedom, like you said, even if I disagree.
Yeah. And it's your duty as a Scottish Rite Mason to do it. You've obligated yourself to do that.
That's right.
The interesting thing to me is, even before you enter the chapter, you're asked to profess your consideration of other people's political or religious beliefs. And you have to affirm that
Yes.
that you will give deference to other people's beliefs before you even are allowed in. At the conclusion of the meat of the degree, you're then obligated. So you may have a belief, but now you have an obligation. So it's sort of a beginning and an ending, of that thought.
Yes, and what's more, just to piggyback on that, we say, as your eyes were anointed in the 4th degree and your lips in the 14th, so we now anoint your breast. And this, to me, is making a covenant. I mean, this is more than just promising your brothers that you're going to do this. I mean, this is a covenant with the divine, right?
Yes.
You want to talk about the water and the oil and the...
Well,
we
you
talked
talk
about
about the sacraments and the ancient process in Orthodox Christianity and Roman Catholicism. So the really oldest forms of practice that we know in terms of initiating someone into Christianity. So the first movement of that is baptism with water. And the water is cleansing. It goes back to the more ancient Jewish tradition of the mikvah, which was cleansing in order to prepare one to enter into the sacred relationship with the divine in the temple, right? Well, so we take that as our entry into the Christian mysteries, and water is that. But that's not all there is to it in the ancient forms of Christianity. It's not just baptism, boom, you're a Christian, you're done. The next step then is when you are anointed with oil and you receive the chrism. Chrismation is what it's called, and that has to do with the element of fire. Because, we're told you have to be baptized in both water and fire, right? And so the oil represents fire because oil is a fuel. That's the ancient fuel that's used in lamps. But oil is also used for healing purposes. It's probably the most commonly used medicine in the ancient world was oil. And so if you think about it, what's happening in baptism is you're getting cleansed. Then with the fire element associated with oil, you're not just getting consecrated, you are actually being purified. So you've been cleansed, but that's an external kind of thing in a way. Purification is the heating of something until it actually, from the inside out, changes its composition to some degree, becomes cleaner. We boil water for that reason, to make the water healthier. And so then, once you've had the chrismation, once you've been anointed with the oil, that's when you're then eligible to take the sacrament of communion and receive the wine and the bread. And the wine, of course, is spiritus. So you've had the initiation of water, you've had the initiation of fire, you're now ready to have the initiation of spirit through the wine and the bread, which represents the spiritualized body, the spiritualized matter. And so all of those things, that process of going through those different elements is reflected not only in the Christian tradition, but it's also in alchemy, and it shows up in this degree in the process that you've been talking about.
Yeah, we've got a section on that a little bit later, so we'll certainly revisit that concept, but that is a good explanation of the water and the oil. I appreciated it yesterday. Then the candidate gets to talk by the wise master on good and evil. So they talk about the Persians believed in these two principles, the principle of good and the principle of evil. Principle is a word that me and Noah have wrestled with over the years. And so they're really talking about a fighting back and forth, right? In 17th degree, we talk about Michael and his angels and the dragon and his angels and how there's this perpetual fight. But the point is, we do, from the ritual, it says, we do not believe in the triumph of evil, and we will not despair, and we will continue to fight the good fight and do the work.
All set up for what's coming later.
Yeah, and so we're going to revisit this whole concept of good and evil in a little bit, but this whole we do not believe in the triumph of evil is going to be pretty key to that, so hang on to that one. And so then he's sent back on this journey again, so off he goes again, and how does he propose to search for this truth that he's supposed to go searching? And we say, by following the direction indicated by the great constellations of faith, hope, and charity. So we know that that is his guide. That's wherever it is he's going, whatever this truth is he's going to find, whatever this word is that he's looking for, his key to getting there is faith, hope, and charity. Fair enough. And so then they kind of start closing the chapter down, and their officers are kind of circumambulating around. And the last one is the worshipful master or the wise master and the candidate, and they get to the door and they tell him, "You cannot enter here. You cannot go with us. He's not ready yet." So he says, "Perhaps you're conceited and overly confident. Perhaps you suppose that you already know all that Masonry can teach. If you would learn how little you know, you must be divested of your insignia, which is too often the trappings of vanity and ignorance. To be clothed in sackcloth and ashes is a token of your modesty, humility, and penitence. Only by these qualities can we deserve the compassion and favor of our Father in heaven. Do you consent?" Oh yeah. So that's when he strips off all the regalia that he's wearing. He's in sackcloth and ashes, very penitent and humbled, and then we're off to the next department. Thoughts before we go to the next department?
Well, one of the things that comes to mind for me, the sackcloth and ashes, obviously we think about humility, right? We think about bringing ourselves down to the most uncomfortable and unflattering clothes, right? But I also think the idea of stripping yourself of all the trappings of your degree and all of that and all of the... At this point, you have been given like over a dozen titles in the Scottish Rite that are increasingly lofty as time goes on. You've become a knight under multiple orders. And I think much like the prohibition against vilifying people of a different political opinion, here the idea is if you think of yourself as separate from the rest of people, right? Another political opinion, another religion, people that don't have these orders, how can you really practice the new law that's coming, right? If you other somebody, you've separated yourself. And so I think that we think of sackcloth and ashes as being like a flagellation type thing where we're so bad we have to wear this. But I think a lot of this is trying to strip us of all of the inflated ideas we may have about ourselves entering what is, one of the capstone degrees.
Yeah. At one point, they were working an 18-degree system.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And so this was the ne plus ultra, the whole thing.
Yeah. I like how you put that too, Noah. It's not just thinking yourself better, but apart from. Now, better may be a part of that, but regardless it's the separation that's, I think, the key. Throughout the degree, I've found, at least in my interpretation, a lot of parallel symbology to the Blue Lodge degrees. So this would be akin to the inner rather than the outer, and removing the medals and changing clothes, etc., that we do in preparation for each of the first 3 degrees. But I really do like. I hadn't considered it from the perspective of just being separate from, as opposed to more, my ego is inflated and I am better than you. You could think yourself equal, but still separate.
Yeah.
Right. And there's a parallel here between what's happening with the candidate going to sackcloth and ashes and the fact that the temple itself has been destroyed. And where is it that we're going with that journey with regard to the temple? And where is it that the candidate's going? That's an interesting parallel.
Yeah. I never thought about that, but that makes perfect sense. And Masonry does this all the time, where they'll hit you with multiple symbols that are trying to tell you the same thing. Because we're just not smart enough to get it the first time.
well, because
well, they're reinforcing it.
Yeah, we'll each be drawn to a particular symbol. We talk about this a lot, right? That certain symbols, individuals are drawn to certain symbols. So one thing may speak to me that you didn't recognize, but then something speaks to you in the same way that I didn't recognize. We are able, through this, that's the great thing about using the symbols, is we're able to communicate at multiple levels in ways that different people can still get the same concept.
Interesting. So then we're getting ready to go to the second apartment, and the candidate is veiled. So put this veil over him. and we take him to this, most people have a hell scene. And at different times throughout this apartment, the veil's lifted. So the master of ceremonies lifts the veil when he wants him to see something and puts it back down when he doesn't. So in a little bit, we're going to talk about what the master of ceremonies might represent and what the candidate represents. But I found it interesting that the master of ceremonies at times is deciding what he's to see and what he's not to see. In a way, he's both revealing to him, but he's also shielding him at the same time.
Yeah.
It's a protection
There-
as much as.
Yes, and there is a constant theme running through this degree that it's not all just about me and the decisions I make and what I want. And, I can't just make these things happen by deciding that they're going to happen, these changes in my life. So, for example, you go back to the journey that you see the constellations of faith, hope, and charity. The candidate's not making the decision. He's discovering faith, hope, and charity as it's revealed to him by the heavens. That's a significant theme that I think runs through this degree, that we are given aid and help and support divinely throughout our life, and we have to be paying attention for it. We have to be looking for it. We have to know how to do that too.
Yeah.
Yeah, we talk about
And then-
that a lot with providence.
Yeah, and then when it reveals something to you, sometimes, like this candidate, he saw him, but he didn't understand what it was.
Right.
And then you get a lecture, but then sometimes you still don't understand what it
Yeah,
was.
right.
And then you listen to a cool podcast like this, and you still don't understand. But you got to discover. Sometimes you got to discover what that means, for yourself, or maybe you have to hear it 100 times before it finally sinks in, or maybe some event happens in your life that makes it more
Usu-
understandable. But
And usually it's a humbling event, like Noah was talking
yes,
about.
Yeah, those types
That's
of
true.
changes are rarely comfortable.
Right.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, truer words never been spoken than that. So one of the times when they lift the veil, they say that this representation, meaning the hell scene, teaches that the justice of God is certain. It lists the passions that we have to internally war against: ambition, avarice, lust, anger, greed, envy, hatred, malevolence, intolerance, revenge. It is a mighty conflict in which we must first gain mastery over ourselves. And then the candidates asked, do you agree that we need aid and support from on high? And yet, this is just critical sentence after critical sentence to me, because so often we try to do it our doggone selves. We try to think our way through it. We try to, participate our way through it. But, everything in Masonry, right before we do important things, we always ask the divinity to be here. But do we really do it in our own lives when we're getting ready to make a leap like that? But we should. That's what stood out to that. Anybody want to say anything about that before we move on?
I'm just to kind of continue with the parallel symbology, the path that takes you through this hill scene, this darkness. Again, in my interpretation, is very similar to in the second section, the burial and the rubbish of the temple. And then the vices that you have to overcome, in some ways, are symbolized by the ruffians themselves. So again, there's sort of similar lessons shown in a different way that I found as a really good parallel. So someone who's approaching this degree may have a lot more familiarity with the 3 degrees, or particularly the second section. If you approach it from that frame of mind, it may be helpful in some ways to see what we're talking about here.
Right on. Let us set forth in search of the true word, the key that shall unlock for you the gates of the temple of true philosophy, and explain the mighty enigma of existence. And I was going to bring my doggone key. I think it's in a box over there, actually. But it's our key from the 4th degree, right? The veil is lowered and the journey resumes. So then we wind up back in the 3rd apartment. So this is the one that's all bright, lots of light. Everything's happy and good, and he arrives at the door and he gives raps. And I'm not going to tell what the raps are, but they're familiar to all of us, right? This is in a lodge of Rose Croix. So who makes the alarm? It's kind of like who comes here, right? Right back to your same symbolism there, boss. A brother who has taken his obligation in the dark chamber, journeyed 3 days in darkness, just like, and they mentioned the sun, how the sun at winter solstice, is down for 3 days. Not down for 3 days. It's at its lowest point for 3 days. And 3, been taught humility and penitence. And the wise master says, the watcher in the desert looks anxiously towards the east for the coming dawn, which we use that almost exact same language in 17, the opening of 17. And throughout the degrees, we talk an awful lot about we're waiting on the rising sun. We've long awaited the rising of the sun. Usually, the sun is about to rise upon the waters of the Dead Sea. Over and over we see this anticipation of this coming sun, and it's just a prevailing theme throughout all the degrees. And here it is again, so I pointed it out.
Yeah.
Anybody want to say anything about that?
I would just say that, there's one thing that's really worth studying that shows up in many, many different traditions is what's called the solar myth. Mm-hmm. And it's the idea that all of the great prophets and saviors and redeemers of humanity throughout history, and everybody, in fact, that takes the hero's journey, that goes on this quest for enlightenment, that journey is allegorically represented by the journey of the sun. So you were just pointing that out with how the sun at the winter solstice appears to stay at this lowest place for 3 days, and before it starts its ascent back higher into the heavens as it approaches towards spring and summer. And so that solar myth shows up over and over in all kinds of different cultures, that the sun and its journey is a metaphorical representation for our own journey of enlightenment.
I want to ask for you to repeat something there, because most of us have been exposed in some way, shape, or form to talking about the sun and religion being connected, right?
Yes.
But the way you just put it, I think, is so important, that the sun and the solar procession, that is the allegory for the actual journey.
Yes.
Not the whole journey is just talking about the sun,
Yeah,
but rather
it's
that we
sun,
use,
yeah.
that's right, we use solar symbolism
Yeah.
to talk about
Right.
the real thing, right?
Yeah.
That's very true. Now, of course, the journey of the sun through the constellations in the course of a year has lots of implications for agriculture and all that kind of stuff. So there have been some people who have tried to say, well, all of this is about agriculture. That's what it's about. That's, to your point, that's looking in the wrong direction.
Right.
That really all of that is allegorical for our own journey and our own maturation and development. Yeah.
Okay, so the candidate is then shown 4 transparencies, one at a time, and they do that, they're lifting his veil. So he's still wearing the veil, they're lifting it every time. One is infinity, one is nature, one is reason, and one is immortality. We have a whole block on this in a little bit, so we don't want to get bogged down in it, but the wise master says, nature and reason unite, demonstrating the infinity of God and the immortality of the divine essence of man. Mm-hmm. And this acronym, NRI, is what we call the true word. So we're given different words throughout these degrees, but this is one of the times where you get a word, and this one we label the true word. Whole block on it coming up. So then there's some lectures. There's an orator that gives a lecture, and he says, he's talking about the search for truth is not of a specific creed or religion. Interesting. The great enigma, the existence of evil, he's talking about all this. This degree is not specifically Christian. So this is the first of many times that we're going to emphasize throughout these next couple of lectures here that this degree is not specifically Christian. Another block coming up on that. Almost all of these things out of this lecture have a block that we're going to get to in a minute. And then we talk about the new law of love. And then we talk about these multiple explanations of the acronym INRI. So then we go to the expert. There's an expert's lecture and an assistant expert. I treated them really as one. God lays a man's life in the loom of time to a pattern that we cannot see. I just love the quote. God lays a man's life in the loom of time to a pattern that we cannot see.
You and me both. Beautiful imagery is what I wrote on that particular section. And as a side note, I think it would be kind of cool. It's not in the degree, but I think it would be kind of cool if we actually had tapestries, like with different white and black patterns. It could be held up, but I'm innovating at this point.
We can do it. And then he gives an explanation of INRI, infinity being the essence of God, nature being the written thoughts of God, reason being the revelations of the supreme intelligence, and immortality, the part of man that shall never, never, never die. More on this in a minute. Then he's conducted to the wise master in the east, where he gets regalias and signs and tokens, as we always do. And the candidate selects a name, which is the attribute of a knight or a mason. Do we do that, boss?
It's given in the degree. I don't know that we in Greensboro have ever actually done anything outside of the name that's given.
Make a note. Let's start doing that.
Let me jot it down.
Yeah, there's a whole section in the Scottish Rite Ritual Monitoring Guide about that, and actually shows some examples of words that can be used for that very purpose. So it's to be taken seriously.
Yeah.
Obviously, yeah.
I like the idea of it. And then he's actually, there's a knighting ceremony. He's knighted as a knight of the eagle and pelican, or the rose Croix of heirdom. And then the master of ceremonies, he has a little lecture. He talks about the pelican tearing its breast. It says, symbolizes every reformer who has offered up his life for the benefit of humanity. Rex says in his book that the pelican is the same as nature, that it represents nature. The eagle, whose wings bear him above the clouds into the purer atmosphere and nearer to the supreme source of light, the sun, which is the light. The cross is not specific, and this is more from this lecture that the Master of Ceremonies is given. The cross is not specifically a Christian symbol, and in order to use in an older use, it represented, I didn't understand this exactly, Mars, Venus, Mercury, Saturn, and Jupiter. I think I finally puzzled it out, but this is probably not the place to do that. I mean, this is probably the place to do it. So I was trying to figure out how a cross represented those, and so I was trying to think of it Kabbalistically, like on the Kabbalistic tree of life, but those planets don't line up with some of them on this side and some of them on this side. But if you turn that cross sideways and you put it going right through to ferret, then the ones on some are above that line and some are below that line, with the correspondences to the Sephirot. I don't know if that's right or not, but I don't know if that is the reason, the way that they intended to make that symbol work, but it does work with the correspondences.
That's interesting. I've never done that myself. That's interesting.
Then he talks about the cap colors and explains them alchemically. So we'll get to that when we get to the alchemical section. And then we're shown the pentagon and suggests that a man should subject his elemental or lower nature to the influences of the divine spirit. And we talk about the number 7, and essentially what we're doing when we show him the pentagon is we're building the camp. So this is the next symbol in the camp. In the 4th degree, you've got the nonagon. In the 14th, we got the heptagon inside of that, and now we get the pentagon in the 18th degree inside of that. And we're just building that symbol of the camp. So we'll revisit all these when we get to 32. But and then we close. In the closing, there's the new law of love is pretty prominent in the languaging. And that's going to be the last thing we talk about when we finish this lecture, because it's kind of where the whole thing ends up, talking about the new law of love. Okay, so let's talk about the exoteric lessons. I'm just going to read off what they're going to be, and then we'll talk about each one. One is just Pike's rambling style, and the way that he lays background, the history of this degree, nature is God's chesselboard, not specifically Christian, exactly, the French and Scottish history of the thing, and the chamber of reflection and formulas and rituals. So that's the things I want to talk about here. So Pike's rambling style. Pike has this way of going way far afield and giving you tons and tons of background, and you're like, this is the point he's making. But no, this is the point he's making. But then eventually he'll come around and he'll tie this up in one big ball of string, and you realize that all this was just prep work for the point that he's trying to make, and he does this over and over again. I didn't realize it until I really got to reading Pike's work, but it's an effective technique.
Which is why it's so hard when people attempt to just jump right into the midway of a chapter or something like that.
Yeah.
Or it's like, man, I prefer the term meandering, because he's going somewhere. He's just taking a very roundabout way to get there.
Yeah, a lot of times he's telling you, like he's talking about what the ancient Persians believed, right?
Right.
And so, you're all down in this whole concept of good versus evil and the eternal struggle and how there are these two opposing forces but that's not really where he's going. So if you just cherry pick that out of there, then you're missing the context.
Right.
And that's what I'd say a lot of people do. They'll cherry pick out something that he said, but that isn't the point he was making. That was the background he was giving you for the thing. Yeah. So you got to be careful with your Pike. You got to read it all.
There's an interesting point here, though. A lot of this meandering that he does, as you said, going and revisiting or visiting old traditions and old philosophers and thinkers and what they said and what they thought connected with this idea that he's exploring. And I think one of the things that Pike is doing that for is to show us the universality of the human quest for wisdom. Mm-hmm. And that's why the universal application of this degree, rather than saying it is strictly a Christian degree, but rather it is a universal degree that uses the language and symbolism of Christianity to communicate about something that people have been dealing with ever since we became sentient beings. Mm-hmm. And so, yes, I mean, that's just, it's such an essential aspect of the Scottish Rite, too. Yeah.
In this chapter alone, he talks about, he's using the Vedas, Philo, the Jew, the Zenavesta, whatever that is.
It's that's the kind of text for Zoroastrianism. Mm-hmm. So when he's talking about ancient Persia and what the Persians believe, he's talking about Zoroastrianism, and it actually predates Judaism in its current form by a few centuries. But there's a whole lot of similarities there, right? So I agree 100% that the reason that he brings out all this comparative religion is to point out the universality of these principles. But I think he leans so heavily on Zoroastrianism, it seems like a random thing to pick out. But, in Zoroastrianism, you have Ahura Mazda, right? The pure, all good, omnipotent, perfect God. And then by the casting of a light, you immediately get a shadow. Right, and so there's a necessary, evil force, and there's a constant struggle, and at the end of that, there's like a river of fire that the wicked are cursed into. It's all very similar to us, right? And it's not to say that Judaism or Christianity is just Zoroastrianism in a different hat, but we know that there was crossover between early Jews and Persians, right? Mm-hmm. So undoubtedly, it isn't just some wild, exotic religion, but rather is one that may have had, some influence on early Judeo-Christian myth.
Yeah. The other thing to point out, and we may have talked about this in prior discussions, is at the time Pike was writing Morals and Dogma and creating Magnum Opus, he was very much in the mind that there is a seed religion. There is a seed of some divine connection in man that primitive man had that was lost. And I think part of the reason he really leans very heavily on Zoroastrianism and I think Hinduism too in many cases is because of how old they are. It's his attempt to work his way back to what that seed was. What is that ultimate one ancient religion that kind of branched out into everything that we have today?
Very much a Renaissance philosophy, the Sophia Perennis, the idea of a perennial wisdom. It's also it's just that idea that there is an essential wisdom that we're all searching for, and it's there, it's available to us, but it takes us some work to get to it, to discover it, to have our eyes open to it. And so I think there's a really good connection here with this degree, because when we talk about the history of the degree, we can see that it really does embody a lot of those Renaissance principles that came along. I don't want to keep you
Well,
from...
on that note, that's exactly where we're going.
Oh,
So,
okay.
so let me just throw a quote or two in, and then we'll carry on that conversation. Talking about the Rosicrucians, he said they took their philosophy from the old theology of the Egyptians, as Moses and Solomon had done. And I'm wondering how hermetic that is, but their principal rules were to exercise medicine without a fee, to advance the cause of virtue, enlarge the sciences, and induce men to live as the primitive times in the world, going back to your primitive religion. And then I have, my next note is Chuck to expand.
Well, so I'll just... there is a connection when you talk about going back to the ancient Egyptians. So really an essential part of the Renaissance that happened in Europe after the Middle Ages and leading, and it's a philosophical and spiritual movement that then led into the Enlightenment era, or the Age of Reason. An essential aspect of the Renaissance was trying to rediscover ancient wisdom. And that idea of a Sophia Perennis, of a perennial wisdom that was the inspiration for all religions, all of our efforts to understand our being and existence, and to be able to live wisely and have a good life, meaningful life. And so they looked very closely at the Egyptians. They didn't have the benefit of modern science and being able to understand really what the Egyptian hieroglyphs meant, but they did their best, and there was a lot of interpretation and it was symbolism to them. And also, they were really keen on this character called Hermes Trismegistus, who supposedly wrote the Emerald Tablet, which is one of the key documents in the history of alchemy, which has a significant place in this degree. Alchemy has a significant place, and so does the Emerald Tablet of Hermes. So what happened in the Renaissance was they all looked at Hermes Trismegistus, a number of significant Renaissance philosophers looked at Hermes Trismegistus as kind of like the seed bed of a lot of ancient wisdom, that it flowed out of him in a number of different directions. And so you can hear that here, that by looking back to ancient Egypt, because Hermes Trismegistus was thought to be not only Hermes as a Greek god, or what we would call Mercury in the Roman pantheon, but was allied with Thoth, or Thoth, in the Egyptian pantheon. And they considered Thoth to be a more ancient representation of that deity. And Hermes Trismegistus was the incarnation of that deity in human form for basically the Greeks and Egyptians that were working together in the heyday of Alexandria in Egypt. But all of that is to say that this was a very profound shift in Western thought. And it took us from solely relying on religious doctrine and dogma and the hierarchy of a totalitarian political and religious regime to actually exercising our intelligence as individual human beings to try to discover this wisdom, this divine wisdom that resides in us and in everyone else. And then that paved the way for the Age of Reason, what's often called the Enlightenment, the European Enlightenment, when science as we now know it really began to take root and was grown. And alchemy played a key role in the development of science. And that's a Rosicrucian thing, as you just noted, because they said it's the study of nature and regarding nature as the revelation, the physical revelation of the divine and divine laws is one of the ways that we communicate with deity. So the Rosicrucians started, and they became public through the writings of 1614, 1615, and 1616, which were the Fama Fraternitatis, the Confessio Fraternitatis, and the Chemical Wedding of Christian Rosenkreuz. And these three documents spoke about a Rosicrucian philosophy and supposedly an order. Whether there was actually an order that called itself the Rosy Cross or not at that time, we don't know. This may have all been an allegorical representation for things that came out of a group called the Tübingen Circle, which was a group of intellectuals who were studying alchemy, studying Kabbalah, studying Hermeticism, and were devout Christians as well. Lutheran Christians, by the way.
Of course.
And so these three documents created a big uproar in Europe when they came out. Everybody wanted to know who these Rosicrucians were. And some people wanted to become part of them, and some people wanted to hunt them down and destroy them because their thinking was so radical for the time. This idea that you could relate to the divine through nature. Mm-hmm. And
as opposed to the church.
As opposed to the church, right. They talked about the importance of observing the heavens and so on. Well, anyway, if you look at the timeline, there's mentions throughout history after these documents of some orders or some fraternities or societies that may have existed as Rosicrucians. But it was in the middle 1700s then that we find the first real solid evidence of an actual functional Rosicrucian order, and it was Masonic. It was a Masonic high grade called Zersvarzenrose, the Black Rose. And so you see the black and the red. The red's implied, right? Because of the rose. But the black is there, and the black and the red playing such an important role color-wise in our degree today. That first showed up in 1761 in a purge that was happening among Masonic orders in Prague. The royalty wasn't happy with some of the things that were being said in some of the degrees and taught, and so they were trying to get rid of some things, and they found that, and they got rid of it. And Christopher McIntosh thinks that that order was probably actually operating at least as early as 1757. But in 1761, when Stephen Morin put together his collection of degrees, which became the backbone of our current Scottish Rite system, his 18th degree was Knight Rose Croix. Mm-hmm. And in 1763...
He's French.
Yes, yeah, his actual name is like Estienne or something like that.
So it had like either migrated to France or had been there all
Well,
along.
the French were very interested. When the Rosicrucian things happened, there were lots of people in France that were very interested, but there were lots of people in England that were too. And since most of the high degrees that were being created in France and in Germany, those were kind of the places where the things were really taking off, it's not surprising that the French would have had a Rose-Croix degree that took Rosicrucian symbolism and incorporated it into a Masonic form. In 1763, Jean-Baptiste Willermoz, Christian esotericists that some of our watchers today might be familiar with, wrote a Rosicrucian degree as well. And both Tobias Churton and Christopher McIntosh think that there's a good chance, if I remember correctly, both of them think that there's a good chance that it's his version of the 18th degree that was actually then became instituted and practiced as the really first ongoing ritual of the 18th degree in those high grades.
Interesting.
So we had, if they're right, then we can say that that 18th degree was written by a Christian esotericist who really well understood what Rosicrucianism was about and wanted to present its key ideas in a way that fit perfectly within the Masonic milieu. So that degree, you can go back and look at some of the old degrees in some of the books that are available through the Scottish Rite Research Society. But that degree then wasn't overtly esoteric in a lot of its symbolism. A person that was familiar with alchemy could look at it and see that there were alchemical elements to it, or that there was a way to interpret it from an alchemical perspective. But when we finally get to the revised Pike ritual, that's when the alchemical elements are brought forth and made more obvious. And if you look at the Scottish Rite Ritual Monitoring Guide, it's actually public now.
Yeah.
It's not, those are not degree secrets. That the degree does actually reference alchemy. And all of these principles of Rosicrucianism that we were talking about are clearly part of this degree. So there are some Masonic scholars who would say this is not a Rosicrucian degree. Albert Mackey said that, but it's pretty obvious that it is.
Who put the alchemical stuff back in the revised Pike ritual?
Good question. I'm not sure exactly who did that.
Well, good on them. Usually we strip stuff like that out.
Yeah.
Glad we're putting it back in.
Well, yeah, they actually made it more obvious.
Good.
Yeah.
I think Mackey was speaking to his time too. I mean, we see that a lot in interpretations of symbols and in the way certain degrees are not only interpreted, but in the way that I guess they evolve over time. A good one, I think, is we're sitting here, I'm right at the Blazing Star, which at a time, almost every Masonic thinker associated the Blazing Star with the star that's shown to
Magi.
for the Magi, yeah, for Christ. That was their cultural sort of embodiment of what that meant. They were imbued with it basically, so they couldn't get beyond thinking it was that thing. I suspect that, and I don't know this, I'm just sort of pontificating, but I suspect that Mackey was of that time also. He couldn't see beyond his own sort of cultural boundaries, maybe. So a lot of, we have to, my point being, we have to be careful, because a lot of times we do look to our historical
Yes.
Masonic figures to sort of understand either the degrees or symbology of them. And we have to be very careful about that, because they lived in a time, we live in a time today. I think we have access to more information, so there may be more varied opinions on it, but certainly as you go farther back, those scholars lived in a time where they had much more, I think, not only limited resources, but a more limited worldview that filtered some of what they wrote.
Well,
That might have been a bit
no,
off topic.
well, I think it's worth mentioning. I mean, if you look at Russian Freemasonry, right, particularly during the 1800s, there's a lot of paranoia within Russian Freemasonry that there is an inner circle of Rosicrucians that are actually pulling all the strings. And there's a lot of competition over the frontier of Russia with Masonic Grand Lodges, particularly like German, for example, got a lot of headway there. And so I wanted to one-up you on your off-topic, but my point being that this idea that like, oh, you know, this, again, very important degree in Western Freemasonry, that this could actually be of a different order, even though it doesn't really make sense to think of it that way, that would have been like kind of hard to stomach
It
for a
would
lot
have.
of guys.
Yeah,
you know,
for sure.
Particularly if in places there was this feeling that there was an infiltration or something like
Yeah.
that. Right?
Well, and I think we were going to talk about it at some point, but I mean, a lot, not all, but a lot of the high degrees, we talk about it in the 15th and 16th. I don't know if you guys discussed it in the 17th, but you know, there are political aspects to some of these degrees
Very much
from a
so.
historical perspective that the degrees may have been utilized in a way to sort of filter people through certain political ideology, particularly with regards to the Jacobites. But so yeah, I can kind of see like you know, different groups in different areas may actually almost a legitimate concern because there was some reality to it, whether it was in this particular degree or not.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's the esoteric symbols.
Talk about nature as God's trestle board. Nature is at once allegorical and factual, figurative and literal, symbolic and actual. It is a holy scripture of the Mason, and upon it God has written his teachings for men to learn great books of nature of revelation, which are man's spiritual, moral, and Masonic trestle board. I kind of combined two sentences there, but that, you know, we talk about this in our Blue Lodge degree system a fair amount. That's from the second degree. And then there's where is it that we talk about? By it we learn the use of the globes, the system of the world, and preliminary laws of nature. Yeah, that's in second degree. Let's just talk about, Chuck touched on it earlier, but let's expand on this idea of nature as God's trestle board. Because they talk about it in this degree a fair amount. I mean, a lot.
Yeah. Well, so one of the things that the Rosicrucians studied, according to the Fama Fraternitatis, when we say the Rosicrucians, we have to understand that we're talking about a hypothetical group of people that existed. So we're not necessarily talking about a historical group. But one of the things that is touted as being essential to Rosicrucian studies in the Fama Fraternitatis, the very first Rosicrucian manifesto, was Kabbalah. And in Kabbalah, or Kabbalah, depending upon whether you're trying to pronounce it correctly or not, in that tradition, that's where we get the tree of life that we talk so much about in the fourth degree, right? And shows up over and over throughout the Scottish Rite degrees. And one of the things that they say about the tree of life, that structure of those 10 spheres and the way they're interconnected with each other with those different paths, is that is like a schematic of the way creation works. It's also a schematic for consciousness, the way our souls work. And it's supposed to be a schematic for how the divine manifests itself through the act of creation. And so examining nature gives us the opportunity to closely examine what are the effects of these 10 principles that are represented by those spheres on that diagram, that Kabbalistic diagram of the tree of life. What are the effects of those, and how do they relate to each other? And when they connect with each other, what happens? So when we look at nature as the trestle board, that's what we're doing, is we're saying what's going on behind the scenes, because a trestle board, right, is a collection of symbols that we look at and we speculate upon because we're speculative Masons. And that's what we're supposed to be doing with nature, looking at that. What's going on behind the scenes there? What does that mean? What can that teach me about God's presence in this world and about the divine will and how it works and how I can align with that more consciously and intentionally?
Yeah, can you top that?
I can't top it. I will. As when I read that and as I contemplate it, I'm drawn to a particular symbol that I sort of took on for myself, and that's phi, the golden ratio, and the common pattern, if you will, that we see in nature, and in some ways points to this grand design that can be overlaid at all the layers that you discussed, Chuck. The microcosmic, macrocosmic, and microcosmic levels, at physical and spiritual. And for me, I just to kind of go back to what I was talking about earlier with the blazing star in the lodge. You take that pentagram and you draw the lines a different way. Guess what you got? You've got a blazing star, right? I said pentagram, but I meant pentagon. If you take the pentagon, you get a pentagram. If you draw the lines in a different way, but hidden within that is the golden ratio. There's a natural order to these things, and so my takeaway from this particular sentence, and I drew the symbols there. Is that it really struck me that the more we contemplate nature and its order, the more we may be able to see or potentially order ourselves physically and spiritually.
Mm-hmm.
Cool.
Yeah, definitely one of the big Enlightenment type thoughts, right? Coming by way of the Renaissance, that Masonic lodges really proliferated, right? Was that you can see God in nature, right? And not necessarily just in the cathedral. But I think, it points to a bigger thing. Like sacred geometry is huge, right? This kind of stuff that we're talking about. We see the signature of the divine or whatever in those things. But I think it also points to the idea that if man is made in the image of God, and we can also see God's handiwork in the world that we live in, then we aren't entirely separate and different from the world we're inhabiting, right?
Yeah, that's right.
And I think when we look at things like correspondences in general, elements, right? Fire, air, and water, and earth, like we talk about these things as they relate to our inner development. I mean, all of our symbols, right, that we've been talking about are worldly things and yet have an analog within us. And so I think this idea, which in the Enlightenment tied into also just generating scientific knowledge, but if we understand nature, then we get closer to understanding divinity. And if we understand ourselves, we get closer to understanding divinity, and vice versa, right? Yeah. So it's a tall order, but one that I think is put out in bold language in this degree.
I really like what you had to say there, and one of the things that it stirred for me is going back to the idea of a trestle board in masonry. Masonry is the builder's art. We're here to work. And a trestle board is supposed to show us the designs for our work. And so as you were talking, one of the things that you facilitated for me was a coming together of that idea with the role that Adam was created for in Genesis, which was to be a steward of creation. That's Adam's role. And when we talk about Adam and we look at Adam from a Kabbalistic perspective, that's the archetype of all humanity. That's not just an individual, a historical individual, but the archetype of all humanity. That's what human beings, that's their divine purpose, is to be stewards of creation. And so we have to study nature if we're going to be stewards of creation. And in doing so, we increasingly discover our own nature, not just that which is outside of us, that it's all interconnected, it's all one.
We're all interconnected.
Yes, absolutely.
As you spoke, Chuck, and if I can just leap onto that a little bit, as you were talking about the trestle board, I mean, one of the things that in my mind, went back to immediately was the constellations that light the path to the true word, faith, hope, and charity. And in some ways, I view, faith, hope, and charity as being what's written on the trestle board. How do we get there? How do we get to the point? We're going ultimately to a point with this degree, right? That there's a new law, right?
Yeah.
How do you get there? Faith, hope, and charity. They not only have to be part of the design from deity, but also a design that you are following. With charity being action, the acting on that faith and hope with all humanity. And I think one of the things that struck me about this degree, and I don't know it because I don't know, the details of all the degrees in Scottish Rite, but it's one of the, at least only places I know of where, at least in the current language of the degree, we're very specific to say that charity is not money.
Right.
That it is a charitable mindset. It is charity of the freedom of conscience of others to think and believe in their own way, in a way that you want to be able to think and believe. But even more than that, it's not that separate, right? We're one. It's the charity that you give to yourself because you are them, they are you. We are. Period.
Yeah.
Yes.
Very good.
It's not an easy path either.
Right about that, brother. Not if you're doing it right. This degree being not specifically Christian, it's mentioned 4 times in the ritual that I found. I could have missed one. All the authors discuss it, and so we kind of talked about that already a little bit, but I just kind of posed this question to the panel. How should non-Christian Scottish Rite Masons come around to the idea that this is okay to use this much obviously Christian symbolism, while at the same time we're saying it's not specifically Christian? How would a non-Christian square that up? And the converse of that is how to be a Christian Scottish Rite Mason and not feel ownership of this degree and feel like it's that it is not only it is specifically Christian, but that to keep yourself from becoming spiritually prideful over that. General thoughts on this? Maybe everybody's just okay with it, but I could see where
I know for a fact that not everybody is.
Right. I mean, we've all seen
Both sides that you described.
Yeah, so I can speak to the, coming from the non-Christian point of view with this. I mean, when I originally went through this degree, I saw the cross and I saw the trappings of Christianity, and I thought this is a Christian degree. And then they come out and outright say it's not. And for me, I think the key is in the Latin meaning of enri that they give, right? That the fire of nature, renovates perfectly, right? This idea of what, again, without commenting on whether or not Jesus Christ died and was resurrected and the whole doctrine of Christianity, if a non-Christian takes Jesus Christ as a character to emulate and looks at his life process as a story and an allegory, if they take it that way, there's so much to be gleaned from that, right? I mean, even if a non-Christian Mason does not have the faith in that story, it doesn't mean that he can't still pull all of the goodness from it in the allegory that we do in every single degree. Right? And then furthermore, I think one of this degree's real values to a non-Christian Mason is the fact that it universalizes what the Christos is, right? That love. And the power of the spiritual resurrection and the power, the renewal power of love, and how it's such an important and integral part of our process. So again, I think like for people that, you know, maybe have like church problems, you know, they need to set those to the side and look at this as, you know, a degree that was, you know, historically, you know, many people believed was Christian. And for Christians, this is a Christian degree, right? I mean, but for non-Christians, there's a lot to get here if they can look at it like they would look at it any other degree.
Yeah, if I can go, and then Chuck can
Yeah.
clean up everything I say wrong. But I want to start by kind of muddying the waters. I mean, based on the history that Chuck just gave a few minutes ago, I think clearly it is a Christian degree. Is it okay to be a Christian degree? Does that mean it's only for Christians? That is a different question.
It is.
The symbolism that's used is clearly Christian in nature. But I'll try to clarify the waters in that the Blue Lodge degrees are clearly aligned with the Judaic set of symbolism, and yet we don't think of them. In fact, if you ask a lot of Masons, you know, at least in this part of the world, they will tell you that and I don't want to go that far. Anyway, I was going to go somewhere else that's pertinent to today. But they will tell you that the Blue Lodge is a Christian, you know, that Freemasonry is a Christian organization. But we don't, you know, most people don't actually see it that way. And clearly the symbolism in the Blue Lodge is not purely Christian. It's Judaic. The point being that the symbol is what is interpreted to the individual in their context. So a Christian, and we say it, the Christian will see, you know, Jesus. A person of Jewish descent may see the Messiah yet to come, and someone who is of neither may see, you know, their own ideal of what that new law really means to them in their religious context.
Yeah, I should have pulled that quote. That was a good one.
Yeah. Now clean up everything I just messed up.
I think you did just fine. I really appreciated both of your comments, and I'm not sure that I have very much to add to that. I think maybe I might just say things in a different way. I think as a Christian Mason, which I am, looking at this and seeing all of the Christian symbolism and Christian language, Jesus is the one that's used as the exemplar for our potentials in this degree. Just like we use Hiram Abiff in the third degree. As a Christian, what I appreciate about this degree being declared non-Christian is that it makes all of that rich symbolism and language and everything that I'm so personally passionate about in a spiritual way available to other people, to other Masons, for whom that may not have been familiar, but now we've got a language that we can speak. They can talk to me in ways now that resonate deeply with me. And when I share something about my spiritual experience using this kind of language that appears in this degree, they now have an opportunity to understand me better.
Yeah.
And so there's that aspect of fraternity, fraternal love, that Masonry is all about. Bringing together people who would have otherwise remained at a perpetual distance in Anderson's Constitutions of 1723. That's why, for me, this has to be not limited to Christians only. Yeah.
And if I can point something out, it wasn't recorded at the beginning. I mean, it's not on this, but Chuck actually talked about how he'll kind of start out kind of quiet, but when he gets really passionate, that's going to really come through clear. And right there, you can hear the passion in the clarity.
Built up to there's only one thing left on these exoteric lessons, and I just didn't want to leave it out. We've kind of already covered it. That's the French and potentially Scottish origins of the degree. I just want to point out that in Formulas and Rituals, which is the oldest, the book This is a book of the rituals that Mackey gave to Pike when he said, here's what we've got, turn this into something. And it was actually a committee they gave it to, but Pike wound up doing all the work. This had 3 18th degrees in it. One said it was from an old French manuscript. One was Mackey's version, I take it, of that same manuscript, or of Mackey's version. And then the other one was also French. It was like a Adoniram system. It was some defunct system. It was like the 8th degree of that system or something. But it was also specifically French. So, I mean, this obviously all these degrees, as we know them, kind of can trace their history back at least to France, and this one obviously does too. So what we're going to do at this point is take a quick break. We're at 1 hour and 21 minutes. We still have the esoteric lesson, so the good stuff's fixing to come up. And we will do these in 2 flights. So I suggest that you, the audience, go take a break also, and then come back and watch the second version. Thanks. Bye.